Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home. From the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home. From the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them.
Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for almost 15 years. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Alice Brody. Thanks for being here, Alice.
Thank you, Trudy.
Alice is a world traveler. She's been to over 50 countries. She's a longtime labor organizer, a local activist, and a very interesting person. So let's start out. Alice, could you tell us a little bit about your background and why you became an activist?
Okay, thank you. I grew up in Philadelphia. We were what you would consider working class poor Jews. And one of the things that my father instilled in myself and my sisters is that we must oppose all forms of racism. My father worked, it was called the installment business, and he had contact in the black community, and every summer he would take each one of us separately on the job and have us meet folks so that we understood that everybody was equal. We were also confronted with issues of anti-Semitism. Particularly my older sister had been beaten up several times, and that's when I learned to fight back. And I even got into a fight with somebody who said that, and I was a little kid, but I know that I hurt the person I was attacking, and I felt very, very good about that. All of those things shaped who I became. And after college, I decided that I wanted to join the Peace Corps, and I did, and I was assigned to Nigeria, to the eastern section of Nigeria, which eventually led to the secession of Biafra. And I was there when the Civil War began, and many of the students that I had taught had died either joining the military or were bombed. And this is something that had a major, major impact upon me. I've never gone back, but I hope one day to be able to go back there. I wasn't ready to go home to the United States, so the Peace Corps assigned me then to Tanzania. Tanzania at that time was considered a socialist country. Many of the liberation movements had their headquarters there, and the African National Congress actually had their base in the town of Morogoro, where I lived. And it was through them that I began to learn about colonialism and imperialism. And one of the things they did is they gave me the book by Frantz Fanon, Black Faces, White Masks. And that really changed my understanding of how I saw the world. When I returned from Africa, I arrived in the United States at a time that the Vietnam War was raging. And I immediately threw myself into it. I was teaching in a high school in New York City. And the high school, many of the other teachers there were also progressive. And when Cambodia was bombed, we all walked out with the students. And I thought to myself, such power. So this is what we mean by union power and the power of the fight for against injustice. And that really shaped even more who I became. I eventually decided that I wanted to work in the labor movement, and I went back to school and got a master's degree in labor studies, and then was hired by the Cornell ILR, the School of Labor Relations in the Capital Region. And I worked there for about 7 years designing education and training programs for labor activists. And I really felt that being part of labor was very, very much a part of who I am, because it was about organizing, fighting injustice, fighting for what the basic needs of working people are. And also I was doing this at a time when the labor movement was very, very strong. Of course, today it's been significantly weakened, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep fighting. I was very involved in the recent strike at Momentum Systems in Waterford, and the fact that the union actually was able to win that battle and reach a settlement was an example of how labor, when it stands up and is united, can fight and win their demands. Let's see. Oh, how I became involved in healthcare. That's also very much a part of who I am, the whole single-payer movement. My significant other, Dwayne Chapman, had unexpectedly passed away. And he had a rare form of lymphoma. And it was a major psychological, personal, emotional loss to me. And I thought, what can I do about it? And it turned out during that time, I came in contact with the national single-payer movement, and we had a very active organization in the Capital Region. And I joined that and continued to work in that movement to the point now where we have something called the New York Health Act, which Assemblyman Richard Gottfried has been a major force in this movement. And each year we lobby, we organize in order to get it passed in New York State. It has significantly passed the New York State Assembly. The Senate is a bigger hurdle to reach, but each year we win over a few more from the Senate. We recently had a massive demonstration and lobby day with the largest turnout. 600 people from all across the state, from Buffalo to Long Island, came to stand up for health care, especially in the face of the attacks being waged by the current Trump administration.
Would you want to talk just a little bit about why you think we need single-payer health care? Why is it so important?
Yes, we're the only developed country in the world that does not have a form of universal health care. We are the only one. And it's shameful. And the result is that people in our country, they die young, they go bankrupt, and they suffer enormously. When President Barack Obama worked hard for the New York, what is it called?
Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act, we knew that it basically would benefit the business community. It did expand Medicaid, but that was state by state. So in New York State, we accepted that expansion, and hundreds of thousands of people had access to health care that didn't before. But what happened is we watched every year the costs going up, the deductibles increased, and also there were states across the U.S. that refused to adopt it, that turned down adding Medicaid assistance. And so when the Trump administration came out and said, first act on our agenda is to dismantle Obamacare, we jumped into the fray, not to defend it, but to say there is an option, and that option is single-payer health care. And New York State and California are in the lead nationally to pass legislation in their own states. And we were unable to win over the Senate this time, but each time we go, we gain more and more people, where we feel that there's a growing movement nationally and in New York that that is the only solution to healthcare, to bring us up to the standards that Canada, Europe, and Australia and so forth, all the developed countries that protect the health of their citizens.
Do you think there's hope that we will get single-payer health care at some point? Do you see us moving in that direction?
Yes, yes, because this year was significantly different than last year, both by the turnout, both by there were members of the IDC, a few of them, the Independent Democratic Council, that have that joined with the Senate, that several of them endorsed it. And we think as healthcare continues to deteriorate, that there won't be any other option except a form of single-payer Medicare for all. But it will be a fight. It's a battle, because we continue to fight against the big hospitals, the whole healthcare industry, the drug industry. We are up against major corporations that will do everything they can to kill this. But I wouldn't keep waging this fight if I didn't think that there was a light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. Now, let's turn to labor activism. You've done a lot of that over the years. So where do we go from here? Do you think there's a hope to revive the labor movement? What's happening?
Well, labor in many ways is at its lowest point. The percentage of people, of workers in unions today is minuscule. Many states do not even have labor unions. They're right-to-work states throughout the South, the Midwest, and these are states where workers don't have benefits and they're paid very poorly. New York State and California have the highest percentage of organized workers. And New York State, it has really, I have to say, we have people, some excellent leadership. That doesn't mean that there can't still be in New York State efforts to destroy the unions. Some of it, of course, is through shipping jobs overseas to third world countries. A lot of jobs have been lost that way. There are low-paid jobs, but where there aren't unions. But we do have some strong unions. SEIU is a very strong union. I probably shouldn't single out the names of unions, but many unions. So I would say that in our state, we have a very active labor movement. And the recent momentous strike that took place in Waterford, New York, against a huge hedge fund, a major hedge fund, that they waged a battle with support all over the state, and they won. They held out and they won. And they really serve as an example of how labor should fight and how you can win.
So there is some success.
Yes, yes.
There is. Well, let's turn to another topic I know you're really interested in. I know you were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and you brought a book today. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I think another, there are many things that shape all of us, and issues of race and racism are very much at the heart of who we are as a nation. And we still have Jim Crow. We have the largest population in the world of people of color in our prisons. It's like chattel slavery. That's how I see it. I really recommend, if you haven't read this book, The New Jim Crow, that you should, because it lays out the nature of the history from slavery to Jim Crow to where we are today, to mass incarceration. And the Black Lives Matter movement is critical. It's absolutely essential. And we should do everything we can to support it, both in Albany, both across the state. But we cannot, as a country, as a movement, we cannot move forward without the role that Blacks and other people of color, Latinos, that they face, that they suffer, and we have to be there to provide that support. And this is very much a part also of who I am as a person, both because of my experiences not just in Africa, but growing up in Philadelphia and being exposed to racism as a child and knowing that it's an evil system. And under the Trump administration, unfortunately, we're going to see it rise in a way even further than we have over the last few decades.
Okay, let's move on to talk about President Trump. We have about 12 minutes left. How do you see activism changing since Donald Trump was elected, and where do you see us going?
Well, I think it's one of the most dangerous things that has happened in this country. And we have no option but to fight. And it means building very, very broad coalitions, bringing in people perhaps who've never been engaged in political action of any sort. We're seeing a growth of this in different areas. Certainly in New York State, we've seen new movements spring up. We've seen demonstrations that are larger and more diverse than ever. We've seen people who have been on the sidelines and not been political at all, knowing that we have to fight this scourge, and it is a scourge. And we have to move quickly because the Trump administration is moving very, very fast. And to shut down opportunities, doors that were previously open are being closed. And fortunately in New York State, we're a state of great deal of activism, not just New York City, but upstate as well. But what this calls for is a very, very broad coalition, working with religious organizations. I am part of an organization that is fighting against Islamophobia. And we need to do what we can to protect refugees and Muslims in our community who are very, very vulnerable. And this is something that needs to be seen as part of the larger movement against possible fascism under the Trump administration. Like many of us, you know, I think about my children, my grandchildren, what kind of country they're going to grow up in. And this is something that we, as you know, as Americans, we have to take a stand. And we have to go out and educate people and help them realize the grave danger that we face as a nation.
One thing we didn't talk about yet is war. I know you've been a long time war
Yes.
protester as well. Do you think Trump is going to get us involved in a war with Syria or maybe with North Korea or maybe both?
Yes, Iran too, possibly.
Iran. And what do you think we can do about it?
We need to build the biggest anti-war movement than we have seen in this country since the Vietnam War. We all know that war is horrific, and we have an obligation and a responsibility living in the greatest imperial power in the world today. and it is our responsibility to stand up and build this movement, and do it quickly, because we're watching doors being shut, and we have to fight to keep them open, because it will put not only people, the rest of the world in danger, but it will also put Americans in danger in a way that they haven't experienced in a long time.
I wanted to ask you if you've traveled to 50 countries.
And more.
And more. Some of us haven't traveled to any countries. I wonder how that's changed your perspective on the world. I know the term exceptional American, I think a lot of us don't understand what it's like to be at war because we've never seen the results of it up close. I know you've been to Iran, you've been to the West Bank. What can you tell us about that?
Well, one of the things we're seeing globally is countries are moving farther and farther to the right. I visited Turkey 2 years ago, and shortly after I left, and at that time it seemed like Erdogan, the president, was, you know, not necessarily a dictator. Well, he's become a dictator, and the situation in Turkey is very, very ugly. And I've been to Palestine, and as a Jew, it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking to me to see a people who suffered in the Holocaust to turn around and to do what they do to the Palestinians, who have every right to live there. And that's a whole other story, but that's a very, very important issue to me. We have a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. We meet regularly. We recently, they held a conference with 1,000 people attending, many, many young people. And so there are youth who understand that this occupation of Palestine must end. If Israel is to be considered a democratic country, then it has to end the occupation in Palestine. But as I said earlier, that countries are moving further to the right. I mean, the election of Trump, we see this in Europe, dangers of right-wing movements in some of the Eastern European countries. And this is happening globally. I don't fully understand why, but it is happening, and it doesn't look good. So I can't speak so much for those countries. I can speak for us. As I said, we must fight to protect immigrants. We must fight against racism, continue against African Americans, as well as Muslims in our country. And that we all have an obligation to do that, because I forget who it was that said that, but first they came for, then they came for, and then there I was. And we can't wait till all these things happen and then say, okay, now I'll get involved. We have to be doing, we have to see ourselves as activists. Whatever movement you feel connected to, whether it's healthcare, whether it's LGBT issues, whether it's anti-war, this is the time for every one of us to stand up and fight against what could be, I don't like to use the word fascism lightly, but we have to stand up against these forces growing in our own country and around the world.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, I know you're a grandmother now, and I'm wondering, how has that changed your perspective on things, and how do you see the future for your grandchild?
Oh, that's a significant question. When I didn't have grandchildren, I thought I could just do anything, you know, be everywhere, do anything, even put myself at risk. But when you see these little, my daughter has a little boy who will be 3, and the newest one is a little girl who is 7, will be 8 weeks old. And I look at them and I say, what kind of world do I want them to grow up in? Do I want them to grow up in a country that is like a third world country that has a tiny handful of very wealthy billionaires at the top and hundreds of millions of poor, in the way that, you know, Trump appealed to poor white working class people? I'm just throwing that in. That's something that we have to address in ourselves. But I do worry, and in some ways it's changed me when I look at these little people and I think how I want to protect them, and I want to be there for them, and I want to support their parents to see that this is the world that their children are going to face.
Okay. We've got maybe 3 minutes left. Are there any issues you'd like to talk about that we haven't talked about yet today?
Boy, we've really
covered a lot of ground.
We've really covered a great deal. I think the last thing I would say is that when you look at the world today, it's not in very good shape. I didn't talk about the climate crisis. We now have an administration that says there's no such thing, that wants to open up new coal mines, that say it's a hoax. Climate change is a hoax. We're going to have to fight that, every one of us. And while it's not the main area I'm in, every one of us has a responsibility to do something to expose and fight against this denial that will hurt millions of people in this country, just like you see in Alabama and all along the coast, these people whose homes have been swept away. These are often poor white, poor black folks. We'll all be affected. And this fight against climate change needs to also be at the center of what we do.
All right, in 1 minute or less, Alice, could you give people who are watching some advice, 2 minutes we have left, some quick advice on what they can do if they're motivated right now to do something? What should they do? Should they call their congressperson? Should they get involved in an organization? And what would you suggest?
Those things and more. First, to get involved in your community. There's many, many issues locally in your town, in your municipality. There's many, many issues. Organize groups to go visit your congresspeople, your legislators. If they're not doing what they should be doing, organize, have a rally. Everybody needs to do something, because change doesn't come unless millions of people stand up and say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And we're seeing this, and we're even seeing this in the capital region.
Okay.
And is that it?
Well, that's good.
Okay.
That's good. I think that's a good place to stop.
Yes.
That was a great way to bring it all together. I think that you've lived a very meaningful life. You've done really wonderful things. I hope you'll continue to do all these things. I thank you so much for being here today. And I want to thank the people watching as well. And please join us for future shows where we'll be talking about the potential for a nuclear war, the buildup of the arms race under President Trump, and no doubt there'll be breaking stories that we can't even imagine at this point. Thank you. Thank you, Alice.
And thank you, Trudy, for what you do. Thank you.